Hey guys, Jake from 8020 Media here. Today we're going to be talking about performance modifications and upgrades for the first generation Lexus IS300, which used the naturally aspirated version of the legendary 2JZ, the 2JZ-GE. The first gen IS300 was produced from 2000 until 2005, and after 2005, Lexus went ahead and switched things up. In the IS300C, they used the 3-liter naturally aspirated 3GR FE. So it was just for a quick 5-year span that the IS300 got the fun 2JZ engine before it was upgraded to something else. In this video, just because the 2JZ is a little bit more fun than the other engines, we're going to go ahead and talk about performance modifications specifically for the first generation. The second and third generations are going to have different modification lists because they're different engines. While it's the 2JZ, it's not the turbocharged version, and unfortunately it's not quite as fun as the 2JZ turbo version that was used in things like the Supra, and that's because these things don't produce a ton of power in naturally aspirated form, and getting them to produce significant levels of power starts to get pretty expensive because we have to look into forced induction, and then pretty quickly after forced induction is when you'll start to need to look at internal and block modifications as well. However, if you have a big budget, these engines can produce a ton of power. They just need a good bit of additional support once we start talking about pushing beyond the 400 or so wheel horsepower level. So with that being said, guys, I'm just going to be talking about the basic bolt-on modifications here. Everything on this list is going to get the IS300 to about 225 wheel horsepower. Now these things produce 217 horsepower from the factory, so we're not talking about serious power gains coming from this platform just from basic bolt-on modifications. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the basic bolt-on modifications here in naturally aspirated form, and then at the end of this video I'm going to talk about my opinion on what your options are for building out an IS300 with the 2JZ-GE. First off, from a power limit standpoint, 400 wheel horsepower is about the power level that these engines can handle before you need to start looking into block and internal modifications. Now, 350 wheel horsepower is probably more so the safe, reliable limit, just because closer to 400s when we start to introduce potential internal failures, but generally speaking, up to about 400 wheel horsepower is what these engines can make. With all that being said, the world record for a stock engine on stock internals naturally aspirated is 320 wheel horsepower. So in natural aspiration form, these engines can produce some pretty decent power levels. However, the owner of that build has rumored to invested $20,000 to $25,000 into it. So at that budget, you might as well full send it on a turbo setup. Anyways, guys, with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our list of modifications here. The first one on my list is going to be a cold air intake. An intake's just going to help bring a little bit more air to the engine in completely stock form without tuning. It's probably not going to add more than 2 to 3 wheel horsepower, but when you combine that with proper tuning, you can get a little bit of additional power gains out of it. It's still not going to be a huge power adder, but it is something that you can get 5 to 7 wheel horsepower out of. If you're looking to maximize your power in naturally aspirated form, then a cold air intake is definitely worth it. Second on our list of modifications is going to be exhaust upgrades. My order from most beneficial to least beneficial is first going to be the headers, second is going to be the Y pipe, and then third is going to be the catback portion of the exhaust system. If you want to take things a little bit further and upgrade the Y pipe and the catback exhaust, a full exhaust system can get you somewhere around 15 wheel horsepower, maybe upwards of 20 wheel horsepower with proper tuning. Exhaust upgrades, not huge power adders either, but doing a full exhaust setup on these vehicles can totally be worth it just to help bring a solid amount of power out of these things for a relatively cost-effective price. If a full exhaust setup is a little bit too expensive, then I'd recommend just doing the headers and the J-pipe. The third modification here is a little bit debated as well as a little bit more complex, and that is an adjustable exhaust cam gear. The exhaust valve timing is controlled by an exhaust cam gear, and while it's typically most common to upgrade the cam gear when you're running a aftermarket cam with higher lift as well as a turbocharger, it still does provide some performance benefits in completely stock form with a stock camshaft. Some people will opt to upgrade the exhaust cam gear. The recommended setting is setting it to -4, and there are some dyno-proven gains at about 6 to 8 wheel horsepower with this cam gear set to -4. In addition to getting a little bit of power gains, you also get a better power band and power curve out of it. Overall, it's a worthwhile modification, again, if you're looking to maximize things in stock form. And you're gonna need it if you end up going with an upgraded camshaft and forced induction down the road. And so it is something that is usable later on if you decide to go the forced induction route. The last modification on this list is gonna be tuning. Tuning is by far the most beneficial one on the list. It's where you're gonna get your biggest power gains from, especially when tuning is used in conjunction with an intake and exhaust system and potentially a cam gear if you're interested in doing that too. But the reason I put it last on my list is because tuning these engines is a lot more difficult than just throwing a flash tune on it with something like a Cobb access port. There aren't any aftermarket plug-and-play devices that are still around for these, so your only option for tuning is to get a standalone ECU with custom tuning from a tuner. Now, a standalone ECU is something that you're gonna have to have if you go forced induction, so it is something that's a worthwhile investment that you can continue to use down the road. But if you know you're not planning to go forced induction, then looking at a standalone ECU plus custom tuning can run you quite a bit of money. On a budget setup, you're probably looking at $1,500. Depending on where you go from there, it could get upwards of $2,000 or $3,000. Ultimately, a standalone ECU is expensive when you factor that in with custom tuning, so it's one of the most expensive things on this list, and something that you could opt to skip if you just want to throw an intake and exhaust on there, get some slight power gains and be happy with it. But it's also something that's worthwhile to have down the road if you do plan on adding a turbocharger. So those are our main bolt-on modifications to talk about here. Like I said earlier in the video, they're not the most exciting when we talk about tuning and intake and exhaust system and 225 wheel horsepower. I mean, this is a 2JZ, right? You read all these stories online of people with the 2JZ putting out crazy power levels, and then I tell you that bolt-on mods are gonna get you to 225 wheel horsepower. And if you choose to do tuning along with that, it's still gonna cost you a few $1,000s for all of those modifications. So where does that leave us? In my opinion, that really leaves us with two routes here. The first route being throw an exhaust and an intake on it and be happy with where you're at. And the second route being sending it on a proper turbo setup, or send it, spend probably 20 grand plus, and you'll be able to eclipse the 500 wheel horsepower mark, which is pretty significant and are nice power gains, especially for a car of this size. These older IS300s do look great. It just is a pay-to-play platform, in my opinion. With that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what that means getting a proper turbo setup, mostly from a cost standpoint. Like I said, we can get to about 400 wheel horsepower before we need to start considering more advanced modifications like block and internal upgrades, but to get there, of course, we need forced induction. The biggest issue on these 2JZ-GE engines is going to be the electronics. Outside of needing your turbo kit, you're also going to need fueling upgrades, but outside of that, we're going to need electronics to handle boost control, to handle fuel management. We're going to need a standalone ECU. And so when you factor that in and all of the other accessories and things that you need to properly turbocharge a 2JZ-GE, you're looking at probably $10,000 or so to get you to that 350 to 400 wheel horsepower mark. Now, you can get setups that push beyond that, but at that point, then we're talking about cracking into the engine and doing some more of those serious and significant modifications. So it is a 2JZ. Once you do some of those internal and block modifications, these things can easily handle above 500, 600 wheel horsepower. And so you have a ton of room to run, but it starts to get very expensive to do that. I would say if I had to kind of sum upgrading and modifying an IS300 down into kind of one sentence, my thought on it is it's really all or nothing. You send it for the big power build, or you're stuck with a not very powerful car. But with that being said, if you appreciate your car for what it is, throwing a couple basic modifications on there and getting 10, 15, or 20 wheel horsepower will add a little bit of enjoyment and make the car feel a little bit faster. So guys, I'm sorry that this wasn't more exciting and that we didn't jump into all of the different options that you have for turbocharging and really taking these engines and sending them to the moon, but there are just so many different routes that you can go that we would need to dedicate a whole separate longer video to that. There are options out there to go a budget route and bolt a budget turbocharger onto these and use the factory ECU with no tuning. However, I wouldn't say that they're safe, reliable, or recommended. If you do have a very limited budget and you're okay with potentially blowing a motor, then that's something that you can look into for fun and see how you can really budget build one of these things to 350 wheel horsepower. But we always believe in building things the right way, spending money where money needs to be spent to get you a reliable, safe, and fast setup. And that's just not something that you can do on these engines without serious investments. That covers it on this video, guys. At some point down the road, we will do a lot more talking about the 2JZ engines as well as the 2JZ-GE. So go ahead and click this like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for future content.